Störung von unserer Seite aus. Leia und ich, Laurenz, wir machen hier jede Woche die Technik. Wir sind hier studentische Angestellte an der Uni Hamburg und das heißt, wir sind heute hier im Streik eigentlich. Und trotzdem sind wir hier, ne? Weil uns das wichtig ist, dass es hier die Bildung zum Klimawandel gibt. Und wir wollten es aber nicht unkommentiert lassen, dass das eigentlich ein Unding ist, dass wir keinen Tarifvertrag haben, dass wir keine Verhandlungsmacht gegenüber unserem Arbeitgeber haben, dass wir einfach nur austauschbar sind. Tatsächlich sind Leia und ich hier an der Uni Hamburg vom E-Learning-Büro aus Sachmitteln angestellt. So, also noch mehr als Humankapital behandelt werden, kann ich mir schwer vorstellen. Ja, das war ja heute und gestern und morgen nur ein Warnstreik. Hoffentlich wird es zu vernünftigen Tarifverhandlungen kommen, wird es für studentische Angestellte einen Tarifabschluss, einen Tarifvertrag tatsächlich mal geben. Und ja, falls ihr unter studentische Angestellte sein solltet an der Uni Hamburg und es noch zu einem richtigen Streik kommen sollte, möchte ich nochmal hier an dieser Stelle alle dazu aufrufen, mitzumachen. Vielen Dank.
Yes, so thank you, Lawrence. And also from our side, from the team, we cannot stress enough how important Leia and Lawrence are for our lecture. I don't know if you remember our beginnings, but we didn't have the support in the beginning, and it was stressful for us. So they really are a very important part of our team. So thank you again for being here today. So coming to our climate workshop, we already talked about it, but it's such an important topic that I want to mention it again. So we are organizing a climate workshop on the 6th of December. And it's in cooperation with the Jupiter campus. It's at the Mönckebergstraße. And this workshop is completely free for you. So we organized it. It's a lot of work for us. And we would be it's very important to us that we have many people who are interested in this, because when nobody comes, we cannot do it again. So I just wanted to present to you why I think this workshop is so important. So we will have a special method that will be used at this climate workshop to show you or give you information about the climate crisis and about interactions of different factors of the climate crisis. So you can really visualize it and you can really learn a lot from it. This workshop is 3 hours, so it's not too much of your time. And everything will be based on the IPCC report. So if you don't have the time or don't want to make the effort to read the full IPCC report, which I really much understand, then maybe this could be a good opportunity for you to learn about the climate crisis. So if you're interested, please, here you can click on the link. We posted in the Zoom chat. You can scan it, and we would be very, very happy if some of you show up. Next point. So at the moment, there is the Public Climate School. It's this week, and it's organized by the students of For Future. So if you go online and Google it, you can find all the program that they have. And this lecture today is also part of the Public Climate Week. So I wanted to mention it here, Public Climate School. You can also scan the QR code or inform yourself. And last but not least, we finally have the full plan for the semester, so we're very proud of that. Today we have our first lecture in the part of climate justice. I don't know why the light is up. Okay. And so you see we have 2 other big parts coming up, and we will also post it so you can look it up yourself. Yes, so one last information. As always, this lecture will be recorded. So if you don't want to be part of the video, you don't want your voice on the video, it's completely fine. Just tell me when I'm coming up, when you raise your hand to ask a question, just tell me the question and I will ask it for you. Okay, so now I will present to you our lecturer. It's Grace Mbungu. It's the first lecture of the part Climate Justice. And Grace, we're very grateful that you're here today. She comes from Berlin and she's a scientific researcher at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam. And her research is, so it's a very broad research. And one point of it is the research about accessibility of energy sources, as well as just transition in the global south. So very important topic. And she will share a little bit of her knowledge today. And also I found one saying from you that I found very nice. So you said that your vision is that one day everyone will have access to clean energy services, a good standard of living, and also a high well-being in general. And I think with these words, I will give the word to you. And thank you for coming here.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Grace Mbungu, and I'm Senior Fellow at the Africa Policy Research Institute. So my...
Just,
no?
I don't know why the slides are not working. Second. Okay. Short interruption. I'm sorry. It's fine.
So I am the climate change program at the Africa Policy Research Institute. Before I worked at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, where I met Francisca Mula, and we also did a few things together. So I'm really delighted to be here today speaking about climate and energy justice, injustice, and dynamics and dimensions in Africa. So before I actually begin, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for making the time to be here. I mean, this is something that a lot of people are aware about, but are not really engaged in. So it's, and I think to make progress, we need really to have that sort of societal consensus of the challenges and also to learn about the opportunities to actually make progress. I would also like to express my sincere thanks to people that are joining us online. So thank you so much for making the time to join us online as well. So what am I going to talk about today? I would like to speak about the climate change as the broader term, and then address the issue of climate injustice and justice. I'll speak about energy and energy injustice, the outlook for Africa, challenges and barriers in addressing climate and energy injustice, and potential pathways. And then I'll conclude with a summary and way forward. So what is climate change? According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate change is a change in global atmosphere in which science has now proven that it's directly or indirectly attributed to human behavior. That is how we live, how we consume, and how we produce goods and services. This video that I'm about to show you really demonstrates what that actually means. So please, let's take our time to really see.
Los. Noch nicht? Short technical delay. Long technical delay. Und los.
It's a term that's become synonymous with saving our planet. It's a term that's become synonymous with saving our planet.
Net zero. Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero.
Net zero. Net
It might sound simple, but many of us are confused by what it actually means and how it could help avert a climate catastrophe.
During the Industrial
To understand, let's go back to the beginning.
During the Industrial Revolution, humans started burning large amounts of fossil fuels, that's oil, gas and coal, increasing the amount of planet-heating pollution in the atmosphere. As levels of pollution have increased, so too have global temperatures. There is now 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere than there was in pre-industrial times, and already we're seeing increasingly extreme impacts of climate change.
In 2015, countries around the world signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement, with an ambition to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Beyond that threshold, the chances of catastrophic and potentially irreversible climate change become much more likely. The latest climate science is really clear that if we want to hit 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce global emissions to reach net zero.
But what exactly does net zero mean? Why not just zero?
Getting to net zero means cutting global emissions as close to zero as possible. We're not going to be able to do that with every single industry. So for those emissions, we need to find a way to balance it out by taking greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. That can be done in two ways, through nature by planting forests or restoring peatlands and soils, and also through technology which can capture carbon dioxide from the air and store it underground. Fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas are the largest contributor to climate change. They account for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of carbon dioxide emissions. And that's why it's really important that we move our sources of energy towards clean, renewable energy like wind and solar.
Reaching net zero will mean a complete transformation of the way we produce and use energy. And while some scientists think change needs to happen far sooner, the International Energy Agency has a plan for how it could be done by 2050.
This is an enormous undertaking. It means reducing carbon dioxide emissions from a record level of around 37 billion tonnes today to just 1.7 billion tonnes in 2050.
It calls for a tripling of renewable energy by 2030 and says around 2/3 of new car sales need to be for electric vehicles. By 2040, half of all existing buildings will need to be retrofitted to make them more energy efficient. And by 2050, almost 70% of electricity will need to come from renewable sources.
That remaining 1.7 billion tonnes needs to be removed from the atmosphere. So that's things like carbon capture technology.
While this is a clear plan to achieve net zero in energy, it won't be without its challenges.
The first is these targets are a long way in the future, which makes it really easy to kick the can down the road when it comes to implementing the policies we need to get there. Another major problem is it's relying on carbon capture technology, which is unproven at scale and remains really expensive. And that's a really big gamble. There's been a weaponization of net zero as well by political groups.
What exactly is going on, and perhaps even what causes of climate change, at least part of it, we've seen where that is coming from. But what does that look like in African countries? Africa is home to 18% of the global population, but account for less than 5% of the cumulative greenhouse gases emissions. This has resulted to African countries being referred to as climate force riders. So people that are really experiencing the impact of climate change despite their least contribution to the problem itself. How Africa has been warming over the last few decades, over the last 100 years or 122 years. Despite the 5%, as we can see, between 1901 to 1930, we had quite some slow warming in North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, and also, as you can see there, as Africa as a continent itself. In fact, during the crisis in 1931 to 1960, we had negative warming trends in the continent, but then peaked again from 1961, and we see where we are at in 1991 to 2022. So what does that really mean? Of course, the result of warming, not, as I said, caused by African countries, has resulted to observed an increased frequency and intensity of climate and weather extremes, which have been seen, for example, in South Africa. We've seen that in Pakistan, for example, just going outside of Africa. In the global south, you've seen sea level rising. And of course, also in terms of people's lives and livelihoods really disappear, and people really struggle to achieve their livelihoods and even basic needs in parts of, for example, where I come from, northern Kenya. There's also something that often is not talked about. So the loss and damage of climate change that is often irreversible, things that you cannot see, your social well-being, your culture, people, things that you've always known. For example, a river that you always went to doesn't exist anymore. The ability for you to actually feed your children doesn't exist anymore. So loss and damage that is both economic, you can value it, but also that which you cannot value. People have lost homes, people have lost their culture, people have lost their identity, people have lost their biodiversity that they depend on, but also the sense of being human is often lost when you cannot depend on the environment on which you've known for a very long period of time. What does that look like on the ground from a human level? It means that people have to travel longer distances to fetch water due to limited availability of water, due to warming, but also due to the practices that we are having today. In parts of Kenya, for example, people have to travel many, many kilometers. When I was actually growing up, we also did this kind of thing, fetch water from wells. But now people have to do that more and more kilometers away. And of course, indigenous communities and local communities that have depended on nature are most impacted. It also means that it also impacts certain groups of people. You see, these are women who have to spend hours and hours fetching water and also trekking over long distances on very hot environments. So why are these vulnerabilities present? Of course, they're not as a result of climate change alone, but they are made worse by climate change itself. So the way we've organized our society, so we value different kinds of people than others. We have gender inequalities. That means that even when domestic work has to happen, women have to do that. So beyond that, we have social and cultural differing activities within indigenous and local communities. So you have things that how people have organized their lives can also result to increased vulnerabilities for some groups of people. Others have also faced continued historical, environmental, energy, and climate injustices that often are not recognized or even addressed. There's also the failure to recognize the diversity and unique needs of local communities and indigenous communities, not just in Africa, but also as we've seen in other parts of the world. So people don't really get them because of the way we've now decided to organize our society. So in that way, they suffer more than as ordinary people who are living in the normal so-called society. Beyond indigenous communities, we have as a result of climate change, a lot of human suffering, loss of life and displacement. These are pictures from northern Kenya and also in Sudan as a result of flooding. So we cannot really explain why these people actually could not explain why they have to suffer despite their limited contribution to the impact, to the causes of climate change. Those are also examples of what people are actually dealing with. I don't intend to only give you negative pictures, but I just want to bring to your attention what the impact of climate change is actually doing to people in the continent of Africa. Injustices are also manifested in the actions that tend to blur or ignore differential responsibilities as well as historical and current injustices, such as new colonialism and extractivism practices. Actions and policies which risk benefiting and harming certain populations. Take the example of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, home to the world's largest reserve of cobalt. I think if we just look on our side, all of us have something like this, or maybe a computer, or maybe even hopes to buy an electric vehicle someday. This is what we need to be able to live this kind of life. But the question then is, where does this come from, and how does our consumption and production benefit or not benefit people of the Republic of the Congo? Of course, we need energy transition. As the video just showed, we have to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but the question is not the transition itself. The question is, how do we transition, and who gets to win and who gets to lose? This is not currently the case in the DRC. According to data from the World Bank, the DRC is one of the poorest countries in the world. In 2022, nearly 62% of the population, 60 million people, so maybe 2/3 of Germany, lived on less than $2.15 a day. Essentially, 1 out of 6 people living in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa lives in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Access to energy numbers, we want to now have electric vehicles, of course, which is important for the environment, but also for the energy transition. But the people that generate the most important part for getting us there, 3% of this population have no access to clean cooking. So you're talking about millions and millions of people without access to clean cooking. Think about 3% only of a country having access to clean cooking. And only 9% of the population of the DRC has access to electricity. How do you call that justice? And how do you equate that to energy transition? So I think we don't engage with these numbers, and we often don't engage with these facts. But when we talk about energy justice, when you talk about climate justice, when you get such examples, then you really get to think that something is really wrong within society. It's not just about the things we want to do for ourselves, but we don't really get a pause to think about what exactly is the impact, or how is what we want affecting what other people want. Host communities actually suffer the most. So the place on which cobalt lies, the people that have been preserving this cobalt so we can all enjoy it and live good lives are the people that now suffer the most. Why is that the case? Someone has to extract the cobalt so we can transition. But that means the how is being ignored. If the how is being ignored, it means that these people are forced to evacuate. from the places which they call home. So they lose their livelihood, they lose the land where they can plant their plants, and they lose everything, essentially everything. So the production of this cobalt, of course, benefits very few people within the DRC. The most wealthy get to keep the money, and the rest, of course, comes to the global north. The other place we can find energy, climate injustice is in the way policy and research discourse is designed and implemented. Privileging climate factors over human factors and social context is an injustice by itself. The narrative goes like this, as we saw in the video. We have CO2, we need to reduce CO2, which is essentially very important. That's something that we all need to get into our minds. But I think transitioning it to what that really means and how we get there is also important, because if we don't think about these things, it translates to how we do business, for example, how we produce cobalt. So we want to reduce CO2 at all costs. If we don't think about humanity, then, or if we privilege some humanity over others, then we could knowingly or unknowingly do injustice to society. Neglecting to analyze our vulnerabilities is produced and evolves over time, which fails to capture the true essence of climate challenges in Africa and global south, but even in the global north. I mean, you have communities that are forced to live in places where there's environmental pollution. These are not people that have means, but people that are poor. So it's not just the global south, but also in the global north. Ignoring different perspectives and diversity of impact. So how we do our research and how we design our policy by privileging one perspective of another, or downplaying and understanding cross-scale interactions and risk potential or policy relevance can be quite damaging in terms of leaving some people behind. The other important thing that also we've engaged quite a lot in my institute at APRI is community level responses. I'll give you an example. We've been conducting research on locally led adaptation in West Africa, in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal. And when we talk to people and say, you're doing really good work, you're protecting their environment, they're like, what are you talking about? They're doing this because they have to do it. They don't really feel that they are actually protecting the environment for which they're doing. So in a sense, we are doing them an injustice by not appreciating, documenting, and even highlighting and supporting the activities that are happening at the local level. So in that sense, these activities get minimized and overlooked in terms of their contributions to addressing climate change impacts. So what is climate justice? We've looked at the injustice. What is climate justice? And this is perhaps what we all, I hope, want to achieve. Climate justice is both a concept and a movement. Climate justice means doing the opposite of what I've just all talked about. So it's putting people at the core of decision-making by centering equity and human rights in climate change actions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in its report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability that focuses on the global south, notes that climate justice comprises of justice that links development, human rights, to achieve right-based approach to addressing climate change. So when we address climate change, we also root it into the social and economic development of humans. We just don't do climate change for the sake of doing climate change, but we do it for protecting humanity and, of course, the ecosystem on which humanity depends. Commonly cited principles of climate justice include equity and fairness, participation, transparency and accountability, respect for human rights, supporting the rights to sustainable development, gender equity and equity, inclusion, especially of young people, young generation, to speak out against intergenerational injustice. Climate justice as a movement recognizes the root causes of the climate crisis and acknowledges that within the multiple phases of production and consumption processes, humans in power have exploited Earth resources and abused the right of less powerful groups in pursuit of their own interests and as a means to maintain the status quo. The movement also seeks to highlight the responsibility of richer nations and corporations for their role in the deterioration of common goods through the historical and current accumulation of wealth via burning of fossil fuels, as we saw in the video, and extraction of common goods from our ecosystem. Proponents of climate justice also seek to broaden the scope of climate action to ensure that it addresses the key challenges of human rights and social inequalities. So how do you pursue climate justice? Through policy, activism, research, and legal frameworks. So what we do to actually address climate justice, if not done well, can be a result to climate justice. So it's really in the how that really matters. These kinds of actions consider and seek to address past, current, and generational impacts of climate change, and holding state and powerful actors accountable for their historic and ongoing climate injustices, including for solutions such as greenwashing. Now I'll move to energy and the energy, the justice and the injustice in energy itself. Why is energy justice important? Energy is described as central to every major opportunity and challenge that the world faces today. Access or lack thereof can determine the level of social and economic development. Energy production, distribution, consumption of fossil fuel or renewable energies have direct or indirect impact on the environment, livelihoods, health, and well-being of humans and ecosystems, of course, on which we all depend. Energy was globally recognized as important in the now Sustainable Development Goals agreed by all the United Nations members in 2015. And the reason why this is important is the Millennium Development Goals did not really recognize energy as a goal. But when it came to the Sustainable Development Goals, energy was recognized as the 7th of the 17 goals, which calls for affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy services for all. Again, how we produce, consume energy as a direct or indirect impact on the achievement of the SDGs.
To close one thing on my laptop of Zoom, 1 second. Okay. Sorry. No, it's okay. So, how energy is produced and consumed impacts SDG 1, that's no poverty. It affects Sustainable Development Goal 2, that is zero hunger. Good health and well-being, SDG 3, quality of education. So how can people study? Can they be able to study at night or not? Can they be able to access digital technology or not? Gender equality and climate action itself, so SDG 13. So energy as itself, it's really, also we need energy to live. So in essence, when you think about energy, you sort of think about, what connects that, the light and stuff, but it's really encompasses or determines the quality of life that we all live.
7 years to 2023, what is the outlook for Africa? So what does that look? What is the achievement of SDG 7 look for Africa, the continent of Africa? By 2021, according to World Bank data, 675 million people in the world didn't have access to electricity. That sounds like a small number, but if we put it into perspective, Africa has 587 people without access to electricity. That's 86.9% of the world of the people without access to electricity. I will let you think that what that really means for 18% of the world population, 86.9% without access to electricity. There are 2.3 billion people in the world without access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. Of those, 51.5% are in the continent of Africa. What does that look like? When we get up in the morning, you go to your espresso press, the coffee is out and you're gone. You turn on the light and things just happen. We turn on our heating and things just happen. But for those populations, 51.5 and over 86%, this is what life looks like for them. This is what cooking looks like without access to the gas, the kind of services that we enjoy. This is what it looks like. And I think these are actually quite good pictures, modest ways of cooking. I mean, just getting that firewood from the forest or collecting it and who does that and how much it takes and how much effort that takes. I mean, this is just a small look of the struggles that people have. The outlook for 2030, when we are supposed to achieve the goal 7, looks like this. So it's not all bad news. We've made some progress, but of course, there are factors that might even compound the success that we've done. Of course, we had COVID. Now we have the war in Ukraine that is sort of minimizing the amount of funding that goes into these processes. The number of people without access to clean cooking energy services is expected to decline by 2030 by a small margin, but 80% of African countries, 42 or 54, have increased population without access to clean cooking energy services. So instead of making progress, really, most of countries in the continent have actually backslided in their progress. With the current trajectory from the data from the International Energy Agency, by 2030, we still have 612 million people without access to clean cooking energy services. What is needed to guarantee universal access by 2030? If we really want to get there by 2030, the annual necessary investment to achieve access to clean cooking by 2030 is around $6 billion per year in US dollars. The bulk of current investment is concentrated in Asia, which is mainly China. And of course, this is internal funding as well. Investment in Africa represents only around 6% of what is necessary to achieve universal clean cooking energy services by 2030. So you have a deficit of 94 of what is needed annually to actually achieve access to clean cooking energy services. So we really, the odds are very small. So moving from energy justice to energy justice, how can we ensure that we actually have energy justice? So we have commonly cited pillars of energy justice, and their references at the end of this, where you can find this information. We have distributional justice, that is fair allocation of costs and benefits and outcomes. So for example, when we have cobalt being produced from the DRC, it means that local communities also get to benefit from that production. When we have hydrogen being proposed or developed in developing countries, renewable energy as well, it means that local communities have a good share of those benefits staying in the country. And then we have procedural justice, which is equitable procedures that engage all stakeholders. We have recognitional justice, which is recognizing the rights and respecting perspectives of all people involved. And then social justice, which is taking into account poverty and inequalities in policies and actions of energy access, production, and distribution. So what is keeping us from making progress in the continent? What are some of the things that we can identify and say that these are some of the things that we need to bring aside, resolve, before we can actually achieve energy and climate justice? I think I would be mistaken not to say that this is a very complex situation. It's complex because of its historical, how we started developing our communities, but also how we do business today. So pre-existing socioeconomic, cultural conditions and challenges, including inequalities within and between countries. We also have a lot of social exclusion and discrimination, both from a gender perspective, race perspective, nationality, socioeconomic status, academic levels of academics, and other disadvantaged groups. And then we have the issue of power dynamics. We get to decide. In some cases, the intersectionality of these challenges is not acknowledged, leading to half-baked or inadequate solutions that are either rejected or unsustainable. For my thesis, for my PhD thesis, I did research on clean cooking. Since the 1980s, there have been so many solutions proposed and implemented in the continent. Almost less than 10% have been successful. We all cook and we all eat. One would ask, why? Why are we not able to provide clean cooking energy services? But often it's because the solutions that are proposed don't really align with people's needs, opportunities, and abilities. So you can access a clean stove today and tomorrow you cannot access it. You can get it loaned to you, but you cannot pay for it. So I think it's really getting into the complexities of what is needed to achieve success that is important. I can't stand here and not talk about colonialism and neocolonialism, because what we understand as prosperity, whether for a country, a group, an individual, has been shaped throughout history by the social construct that stem from colonialism as an ideology. Colonialism laid the foundation for normalization, institutionalization of extremism and environmental destruction practices that we are witnessing around the world today. Contemporary political, economic, scientific, and cultural conditions around the world are shaped by ideology and worldviews that privilege certain groups of people, visions, forms of knowledge, and actions over others. Climate and energy injustices within and beyond countries have implied relationships that are entrenched in structural and institutional arrangements and hierarchies that are their roots in colonialism. And then we have the injustice in the inaction. The vast majority of climate crises, as we've seen in the video and as I've spoken before, are attributed to global North countries. But the international climate policy lags in prioritizing the protection of most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. If you're paying attention, COP is around the corner, and COP27 was about, a lot was spoken about loss and damage. This has taken over 30 years to actually get to the agenda of the COP. So it is an injustice to not take action. The double standards that exist in climate policy and action applying today by countries, of course, I have to say of the global North. So when we say that we need to phase out fossil fuels, we have countries like the United States and the United Kingdom commissioning new fossil fuels projects, but demanding that global South countries keep their coal and oil on the ground. So we have to face these kind of double standards and address them head on if we really have to make progress. The lack of design and implementation of measures to address the impact of climate change is always aligned with objectives of developing countries at the expense of global South countries. So for example, when we say that we need to address climate change and we need to focus on financing for climate change, more money goes to mitigation effort, even in developing countries that contribute 5% of greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to adaptation financing or loss and damage financing. I have to insist that mitigation is very important, but prioritizing climate action based on the needs of different regions of the world is also important if we have to achieve climate justice. There's also the issue of green colonialism, which of course, an example could be the cobalt production in the Congo. This and the energy injustice perpetrates the two-tier society that we see, the haves and the haves not. So we made it normal and okay to have 3% of populations, the DRC, not to, with access to clean cooking energy services. We've normalized what is not normal. We start at the University of Hamburg today, but research, inequality, and technology development is another thing that is also enhancing energy and climate injustice. Limited funding and publication by African researchers, which means knowledge production is dominated by perspectives from the global North, which leads to information about how climate impacts and risks are experienced and dealt with, which of course provides a divide between climate science for the global North and the global South. Lack of investment in technology and infrastructure for global South countries also exacerbates climate injustices. the data and the research itself, not funding research and technological development leads to invisibility and to silencing novel climate action and mainstreaming certain narratives over others. So how we organize and fund research is also something that we have to think about. And I think making sure that researchers of the Global North have as much funding to actually tell their stories, but also design their own narratives of what they feel is good and they need, that is good for them and that they need, is also very important. I think my time is okay. And then we have the finance injustice, which I've talked about in terms of data, but also in terms of how we prioritize climate impacts. For example, mitigation versus adaptation, loss and damage. What is prioritized in loss and damage? Is it economic or non-economic value? And what do people value? And how is that then prioritized? I'll move quickly now to the potential pathways for addressing climate and energy justice. Maybe we have some positive outlook as we leave this room. So intersectionality, that is understood as seeing how various forms of inequality often operate together and impact each other, provides a tool for critically analyzing how different factors contribute to climate change injustice and energy injustice, but how also we can solve these kinds of injustices. For example, women and girls in all their diversity are often disaffected by climate change impact and energy poverty. In the context of climate change, addressing gender inequalities could help reduce the felt and experienced climate change impacts, helping not only women, but also broader society adapt and build resilience to climate change. In respect to energy justice, addressing gender injustices help women improve their opportunities and abilities to sustainably access and use clean and environmentally friendly energy services. I'll move to conclusions, the summary, and way forward. This lecture has painted Africa as a continent of paradoxes. On the one hand, there are deep social and economic inequalities and injustices such as in energy and climate. We've also seen that those who contribute the least are the hardest hit by the climate crisis. Those with the least and in most need are getting the least support and attention. But Africa as a continent is also a land of plenty, with numerous opportunities and massive potential for innovation and growth. It is also home to the youngest population in the world and is endowed with rich energy and natural resources. So one might ask, what are potential pathways forward? So how do we shift the negative or what is not going right to achieving a pathway to more prosperity? Achieving systemic transformation under the banner of climate change justice through the construction of power relations and gender norms, of course, from an intersectional and community-based perspective and approach. We also need to transform our colonial models and structures in our work, in our mindset, how we think about how the world functions today, how we behave, but also in our societal relationships and in all other areas of life. I feel that we also need to demand action that respects human rights of current and future generations, especially of historically marginalized groups. As students or as people in our institutions of higher learning, we need to jog our minds to create alternatives to dominant models and metrics of development, which are rooted in unsustainable production and consumption practices. It is also critical that we integrate human and socio-cultural dimensions into processes of climate and energy policy design and implementation processes. Recognizing the importance of communication and awareness creation in giving people space to envision different visions and perspectives and new opportunities and pathways for societal transformations. Some of us in the room that are researchers will tell you that if you sit behind the desk, you can write a very good paper. You can also do very, very good research. But I think there's a huge gap between policy and action and research translated into policy action, because we often don't know how to communicate what we do. So if we don't communicate what needs to be done or what needs to happen, even in our own household, if you leave the trash there and don't communicate, oh, someone needs to take the trash out, then someone will not take the trash out. So if we don't communicate what needs to be done and what is happening, it's difficult to make progress. Dealing with these issues will take different approaches and dimensions. So quantifiable, something that people can touch. So what is it in for me? So when we do adaptation, for example, what are the entry points that is going to motivate people to take action? It's not just doing adaptation for the sake of adaptation, but I think what we've witnessed in local communities, people tie this to their lives and livelihoods. There should be an economic benefit, a social benefit, a cultural benefit for taking a certain action. I'm sure we are here because we want to have some sort of understanding of the issues and also to engage in these conversations. So we also need to act strategically. If you go to the continent today and start your conversation now, we all need to address climate change. I think a lot of people look at you and say, let's talk tomorrow. But if you go to a continent and tell policymakers in Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, we need not to use the fossil fuels on the ground. We can leave it there because in 20, 30 years, these will be stranded assets. So provide both an economic, but also a strategic argument for why renewable energy is better than fossil fuels. We also need to use the normative approaches and dimensions of action. For example, when we talk about mitigation, methane reduction, for example, and CO2, it's easier to tell someone or to convince a community not to develop fossil fuels if you say to them that it's not going to be good for your health. It's, of course, an economic benefit if you don't get sick, but it's also an ethical thing not to get sick or to make people sick. So the narratives we use, and of course, also ensuring that people's rights are respected, is going to take us further. So we have to choose these approaches in a smart way. So we don't have to act quickly or fast because we see that we are not going anywhere, but we need to be smart and strategic in terms of using the kind of opportunities and entry points that we have. We need to humanize climate action and energy access. What is it? What is that value that this brings? How does that affect people? What is the benefit for people? I was talking to a colleague today, and we thought, how can it be that Algeria or Ghana or the DRC is still poor today. I mean, the paradoxes that we've seen. How can that be that a continent with so much renewable energy doesn't have access, these numbers show these numbers of access to electricity and clean cooking? How can it be a country like the DRC with the largest deposit of cobalt has so many people in poverty? The answer is leadership. So as much as we want to make progress, we have to develop leaders that can actually nurture and take care of the resources that we have, but also ensure that they are equitably distributed. This is the way to achieve climate justice and energy justice. So beyond governance, which of course is highly emphasized, we need to have leadership and ownership. It's not just at the policy level or the political level, it is also at the societal level. Some conclusion and way forward to COP28. I think we all have heard the rumors that something is going to happen in Dubai in a couple of weeks. But I was thinking about it, having this lecture a couple of weeks before COP28, what would I want to happen? Or what would I at least want to see different? There's a lot of things that would be the same. And I think talking in these forums is important. But I think for me, I would want to see some demonstration of willingness to confront and address the dynamics and intersecting power relations and other structural causes of inequality. For example, in the financing infrastructure. How do we finance? Who owns the means of production? And who owns the means and who owns the resources? And how is that distributed? I also would like to see narratives that undermine transformative pathways in favor of narratives that aim to change structural inequalities and deliver cross-cutting benefits for humans and ecological well-being. I would like to see at the COP integration of diverse forms of knowledge by recognizing, valuing, and supporting solutions that exist in different regions. But most importantly, at the local level. For the continent of Africa, I would want to see more prioritization of loss and damage financing, especially in the context of global emissions contributions and current impacts on people in the global south. One might ask, with all these grim and all this what needs to be done, what motivates me? What keeps me doing what I'm doing and also spreading this message? I would want to continue in this path to find solutions that can support and help tip the balance in favor of better quality of life and well-being for current and future generations, both in Africa and elsewhere in the world. I'm also motivated by what connects us as people and how we can use these connections to make progress in both climate and energy spaces. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Grace. Yeah, you can now ask your questions in the room, also on Zoom. If you have questions in the room, just raise your hand. I will come to you. If you have questions on Zoom, we have the F&A tool. Just write down your question and we can read it out in the room.
Hello, I think I can maybe be the icebreaker to open a stall of many more questions. Yeah, thank you so much for your inspirational talk and for giving such a comprehensive overview on climate and energy justice in the African context. Yeah, I've two questions, and the first one is a bit related to the last points that you mentioned with your expectations for the COP. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more what your expectations are for energy issues, because since like 2 COPs or so, we have seen that energy issues have been rising on the COP's agenda, and maybe you would like to comment on that. And my second question is a bit more specific. In the last few years, we have seen the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, evolving, saying that, first starting with South Africa and saying that South Africa needs, the global north in order to be lifted out of the fossilist path dependency, which is a very true historical fact, and that a comprehensive approach is needed to get this done, also in a just way, so that also labor conditions are improved and green jobs are created and so on. And now we see that the JETP is evolving to other countries like to Senegal or Indonesia and Vietnam. And maybe you would also like to comment on that and to what extent this meets the criteria of energy justice, or to what extent it's rather green capitalism at full force. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisca. I think those are two really big questions, because we have, with energy, I think we have 2 challenges that we need to solve, maybe even 3. One is to provide energy access for those that don't have in a clean way. And the other is actually for countries to transition from fossil fuels to more renewable energies. Africa, as we know, is a continent of 54 countries with quite a huge diversity of how energy is produced and consumed, and who has and who doesn't have. In terms of COP, when we talk about energy and energy justice in African countries, I think, for me, what energy justice really means is making sure that all populations in Africa have access to clean, renewable, accessible, and affordable energy services. That is something that I think, for me, is a priority for African countries in general as a continent. But then we have countries like South Africa, but also countries like Nigeria, that is actually predominantly using fossil fuels for development. In this case, I think it's very important that JETP actually came into place, because essentially it helps countries transition through funding, if the funding is just, as you know, that's another elephant in the room. So is it grants, is it loans? Also would depend on where that justice comes. But I think what is essentially important is how that transition happens. So we know that people need jobs in South Africa, and we know that people that are in the core business are the poor. So how we move this process is also critically important. And I've been debating, of course, I think also with you, Francisca, on the issue of the just transition itself. Does that actually fit for the continent? I think it fits for some countries, but I think what I'm looking for is a just transformation. We just don't have energy for the sake of energy. So if we produce energy and have energy access, if we power all the power lines and people don't have access to technologies for productive uses, then we don't have any justice there. So I think the link between energy access, energy transformation to sustainable and transformative development is what justice means for me. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
More questions? I come up.
So you talked about there living a lot of young people on the African continent, and I wondered what your view is on the role of the African youth in the future of science and politics, like how they play into it.
Thank you so much for your question. Africa has been growing in terms of the young generation, and I think they say around 20-something% is below the age of 18. But how this generation gets to become adults is also very important. So the energy injustice and the climate injustice, of course, is impacting the development of this young generation. And I think it's also an opportunity in itself. So the climate crisis and the energy crisis could be an opportunity for the youth in the continent. So education is very important. But I also know that as an African myself, being educated doesn't mean that you get a job. It also doesn't mean that having a job helps you pay your bills. So this is not an issue of the global north. I mean, of course, the things that we have to look back to, such as colonialism, and see how those have structured the kind of systems that we have now. But it's also, as I said, an issue of leadership. So in essence, as much as we are seeking for people to address the inequalities that have happened in the past, it's important that we also develop the youth to take the leadership that is needed to propel the continent in the future that we all wanted to have. But also not just the future, but also the current, because there are so many youth and of course other populations living currently. So I hope I answered your question.
And maybe I have a question connecting to that, because I find it very interesting that you're talking about leadership. I didn't hear about that point before. And what do you think, what kind of leaders do we need, and where can they be found?
I think we are all born leaders. The question is where we actually lose that part of leadership, or who actually who develops to be a leader. And essentially, we cannot take leadership for granted. We've seen parents that can be leaders and others that are just trying to get by, not by their fault of their own, but it's just obviously because of the situations that people live in. But I think leadership starts by acknowledging what is and how we can get better at what we are at. Leadership also comes with ownership. I recently attended a conference in Nairobi on energy and climate justice. And something really caught my attention. An engineer from Ghana said, we do actually need to own our own narratives. If someone comes to talk to me in Chinese, I would have to say, I don't really understand that language. I don't speak Chinese. So if you don't point that out to them, they'll keep speaking to you Chinese and they'll think that you understand it and you will not be communicating. A leader would say, I don't speak Chinese. Do you maybe speak English? This is a language I speak. This is how my life is like. So it's really trying, at least for us Africans as well, to tell the world what we need, what we have, and how we want to develop it. I often like to say in talks, for example, we had one on the global, the G20 Compact with Africa, that aims to develop investment capacity within the continent so people from the G20 countries can invest in African countries. I always ask, but what exactly does the G20 want from Africa? Why is it so important that we actually develop that? And I think leadership points that out, because we, of course, also have to tell people the terms in which our resources can be shared, which is something that we often don't see quite often. So leadership takes a lot of effort. But I think what you're doing here today is a sign of leadership. And the interest in knowing not just the situation of climate change, injustice and energy injustice in Germany and in the global north, but also engaging with what is also happening in other parts of the world, is a sign of leadership. So it's difficult to pinpoint, but I like to say governance is one animal, and it's really kind of focuses on policy and developing, but leaders are the people, the society itself. And I think with climate change justice, we've seen a lot of leadership, especially with the youth, which has, of course, shaken some comfort zones, and for a good reason. So we're already seeing it. I think we need to develop that more. And of course, as I like to say, charity begins at home. So it has to start from ourselves.
More questions?
Right now, there's a lot of movement on the African continent, and there is a growing independence with creating of the African Union. Do you think that the independence from the global north is benefiting towards clean energy and energy justice and helping the people, or is it just like a movement that is happening right now?
I actually didn't get your question right. I'm sorry.
So right now there's a lot of movement on the African continent with like growing more independent from the global north. And do you think that it is benefiting to the cause of helping the people that live there and giving them, like, as you mentioned, clean cooking supplies, for example?
Thank you so much for your question. It's a good thing. I think there are two ways you can actually develop. And I think, like, I'll give you an example of a teenager, sort of a child who is wanting to be, to develop. I think it's really difficult for parents to let go. You be here at 6, and then eventually they become comfortable. And I think we also are very uncomfortable with breaking the status quo. So I think Africans seeking their own independence is a good thing. What I also would like to say is that it's always a good thing to have these multilateral cooperations between nations. Some of you are students of peace, know that since countries started trading with each other, there have been less wars, especially in Europe. So I think Africa needs to position itself as a continent on its own feet and with its own strength. And whatever it takes to do that, it should do it. But it also needs to extend its hand to countries and other continents as well. So it needs to do both ways, but also in a strategic way. So for me, at least being or coming from the continent of observing development and how things are going, If you don't have your own agency, if you don't have your own power, it's very difficult to decide where things can go. They can go in either way, you know, they can go either way. So I think building that agency for African countries, whether it's going to lead to energy access, whether it's going to lead to more development, is a good starting point. And I also think that it's also a good sign that the continent now is represented as one of the members of the G20, because we have a saying in Swahili that says, kuishi kwingi kuona mengi. So if you live in your own jargon at home, you only know what you know. But if you're able to interact with other people, you get more experiences. You're able to see more. You're able to experience more. And you're able to incorporate these new and diverse experiences in how you live and do your business. So I hope I answered your question.
We have time for one last question, so don't be shy. Ja, ich komme rüber.
Could you define leadership, what it means for you? And also, do you have like a concrete imagination kind of what political system would be needed in certain countries of Africa that could improve the situation, like democracy, or should the leadership be embedded, for example, in a democracy?
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one, but thanks for your question. What does leadership mean for me? For me, leadership means owning what is. Whatever it is. If I screwed up, I own it. And seek for ways to do better. So in terms of governance and systems of governance, I'll go back to the idea of where we are today and why we are where we are today in terms of the global north, the global south, developing countries. There are many ways to name this. And say that even before we were colonized, or the African continent was actually colonized, people lived good lives. People organized themselves. But we live in a different world where democracy, I would say, from my perspective, is the best way of doing business. Is it the easiest way? No. Does democracy have a path to giving us justice? Yes and no. But it has a higher chance than autocracy to generating more equal societies in the world. So I'm in favor of democracy.
Okay, so thank you very much, Grace, for your lecture. And we are very much looking forward to seeing you again in December, because we will have a panel talk about the COP actually in December, and Grace is joining us again. So you can look forward to that. And yeah, with that, I will leave you now. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for joining on Zoom. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for joining us online.